far as determining V, couldn't you use the same method as we did in price discrimination? It's like, let's say you're building a park, you
Yeah.
look for like different characteristics that like would attribute to V's. Like, let's say
Yeah.
you charge a family more if by their proximity to the park and like the number of kids they have.
That's a great point, but the problem is, oh, sorry, you're saying if you
If
know
you-
things about the
Yeah,
people.
so you assign a V according to like.
Yeah. Well, so that's exactly the idea of like why we might be able to know the VIs, right? But so that's exactly the sort of strategy we'd use potentially to know the VIs. But the problem is that it's pretty darn hard to get exact knowledge of every person's VI, right? I mean, I agree. What you're saying could help you get some sense for it, but there's still going to be some uncertainty. It's just too hard to know that precisely exactly everyone's willingness to pay, right? And the thing is, people will only agree if VI is greater than SIC. But if SI is only an approximation of VI over V, this is really dangerous, right? Because there could be just somebody who you misestimated by a little bit who says no, and then you scupper the whole project because of that one person, right? So even if we choose, even if C is so much smaller than the V's, and this is a very small probability event, that we end up with someone who genuinely doesn't want to go through with it just because we assigned him the wrong share, right? We just assigned him too high of a share and he like genuinely doesn't support the project at that share. Even if that's a really low probability event, there are so many people that the chance that somebody ends up being like that is actually pretty high, right? So this is why it's really hard to imagine actually putting into practice this sort of unanimity thing, is that it relies so fragilely on exactly knowing everyone's value, because even if there's a slight chance you got it wrong, over a large number of people, that's going to compound, right? We can study this formally by crunching the numbers. So let's imagine that the CDF, the cumulative distribution function of VI, is f of VI, and that everyone has equal shares, right? Independently and identically and independently distributed. That means everyone is drawn from this distribution f, right? Then the probability that any given individual rejects the offer is the probability that their value is below their share of the cost, right? C over M, right? And so therefore the probability that any individual consents to the offer is 1 minus f of C over M, right? And so the probability that everyone consents is 1 minus f of C over n to the n, right? Because we only get it if every person consents, and they're all drawn independently. So imagine that we are able to get the probability that somebody rejects down to 1 part in 1,000, right? That sounds like we really have an incredibly good estimate of people's values. So, but even with that, once we have 1,000 people in the population, which is smaller than the population of the smallest town, right? You know, a small town, that's 35. That's only going to give you a 35% of chance of success if you crunch these numbers, right? And if you have 10,000, which is still a pretty darn small town, you're down to a 1 in 20,000 chance of success, right? So even if you have an incredibly precise estimate of people's values, if there's a large number of people, you're like totally screwed. There's just no chance that this system can work, right? And you can't solve this problem by adjusting shares. In fact, you can prove that the optimal thing to do here is just, if everyone's IID, to offer the same share to everybody. If people are not IID, you use a market power type thing where you divide the shares in proportion to the elasticity of everybody's willingness to accept. And this is not just true of this particular unanimity scheme that I described to you, but in fact, any scheme you can potentially use runs into exactly this problem. So if you try to have people say, oh, what's my value, then they're all going to claim it's really big. If you say, no, we're just going to say, here's a take it or leave it offer, well, then there's always going to be some probability, some small probability that you misestimated and somebody ruins the whole thing. No matter what scheme you use, you always run into this problem. And so basically what we get is that we're damned if we do ask people what their values are, and we're damned if you don't and try to make people these take it or leave it offers. And this is the basis of a very fundamental theorem which really just extends this collective action problem we talked about, which is called the Maylaf and Postlethwaite theorem. So what this states is that if everyone must consent to their funding the project and no external funds are available, the probability that the project is undertaken goes to zero as the number of people gets large under any mechanism you can possibly use. So what this says is there's no voluntary, something in which everyone has to agree, and self-financing system that can ever work. Okay. So that means that we always are going to run into the collective action problem that we described here. There's no way around it. Public projects, either goods or bads, will always require coercion. And this is true in the binary case that we considered, but also more broadly. And coercion can basically operate in two different ways that solve one of the two problems, the concept of being voluntary or self-financing. And in some ways, these are very similar. So, Temis, what are two ways you can imagine the government using coercion to solve this problem?
I guess provide a subsidy.
Yeah, and they'd have to coerce people to raise the money for that subsidy, right? And what's the other way you can imagine doing that?
Direct regulation.
Well, they could just directly force the people to pay, right?
Yeah.
They could. So all the people who were trying to get consent to contribute, we could just force them to contribute rather than allowing them to consent.
Like
right?
a lump sum.
Yeah. So, in other words, both of those are exactly the same thing. It's just an issue of whether the people who are going to benefit are the ones who are coerced or whether some other people are the ones who are coerced, right? So the government can either get rid of consent and just force people in the community to contribute, right? Or it can raise some money from the outside. But how does it do that? Well, it has to raise taxes on somebody else, right? And that's also coercive, right? So that basically means that both strategies require some sort of coercive government taxation in order to achieve it. Now, on the side of public bads, in practice, the government uses a particular approach. And Ben, what is the government? Don't look at your screen. What does the government do in practice when there's a public bad in order to solve the holdout problem? We were talking about this just a few minutes ago.
They forcibly, like in the South America example,
Yep.
they would forcibly take the land away from the people.
Yeah, and what's that called in the United States?
Eminent domain.
Yeah, that's eminent domain, right? So that's what they do on the public bad side. On the public good side, what they usually do is have taxes fund public goods. So local communities raise property taxes to fund parks and schools. Cities raise general revenues for many services. Much of national government spending is financed by taxes on local spending is based on taxes on the people who actually are going to use the service. And in the case of public bads, they use eminent domain. So the government can just take the land from people, impose this cost on them, and they're required to give some sort of just compensation by the Constitution. but this is typically based on like the so-called fair market value of the land, which is usually well below what people actually value their own land they've been living on for a long time at, right? And this is the reason why it caused so much outrage. And the use of this type of system has been greatly expanded in recent years by Supreme Court decisions, which basically said that they could do this not just if they were going to build like a bridge or a road, but like even if they wanted to build like a shopping mall or an industrial complex or something like that. So similar things to this happen for corporate debt or corporate acquisitions. So in most countries, you're not allowed to hold on to your share of a company if someone else wants to acquire the company. There's a vote that happens, and then you're forced to sell your share at whatever price the other people agree to, right? Similarly, in debt, to try to deal with these foreclosure issues, the government started instituting rules that if 60% of people agreed to a change in the terms of the loans, all the other people who own parts of the loans were forced to go along with that, even if they disagreed. And the government can also use coercive tax revenues from the outside. So sometimes this is used for eminent domain situations. Even though you might use eminent domain to make sure there's no holdout, you also might tax a bunch of other people and use that money to subsidize the people to try to get them not to feel so bad about getting their land taken. Okay. Yeah, Terrence.
So for the FCC spectrum, is there an eminent domain over this?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I don't think we really know, but given that the FCC invented the property rights over the spectrum, they're not like really constitutional property rights. The FCC, they're more like regulatory things. I guess what the FCC granted, the FCC can taketh away. Yeah. The FCC giveth and the FCC taketh away. A key question then is if we're going to have to use coercion and government power, we have to have some way, rather than just having everyone agree like we do in markets or using a competitive system, to determine when we're going to invoke the government power in order to do this. Because clearly, for every crappy shopping mall, it's not worth taking away people's land. But on the other hand, there are some projects that are so important that, they really need to get done, and the whole point of having eminent domain is to let them get done, right? So how are we going to make collective decisions about this? When is it worth building a project, right? Well, the basic analysis here is very similar to our discussion of how you can determine what the size of an externality is, right? And David, could you remind us of what were sort of the three ways that we thought of dealing with thinking about externalities?
Yeah, I guess just trying to determine like the marginal benefit, the marginal cost that is present, and then charge a tax or a subsidy equal to that to kind of cancel.
So that was way number one. That was sort of like the scientific cost-benefit analysis type way. And then there were two other approaches we discussed as well.
Just as far as like determining how to eliminate the externality, or to
No, like what the size of the externality was, right? Remember in that
Yeah.
lecture, one way was the scientific way, and then there were two other approaches we talked about.
Just comparing like, I know like comparing what would happen if the person that committed that externality wasn't present, and then kind of comparing those.
Yeah, so the VCG mechanism was one approach, right? The Vickery-Clark-Groves mechanism. We asked everyone to report their value, and then we made them pay their externality on everybody else. So that's one approach. And then there was a third one that we sort of made fun of.
It was just the reported value method?
Yeah, the contingent valuation,
Yeah.
the survey method, right? Yeah. So those were the three approaches we talked about. So assessment by experts, ineffective surveys, or using some fancy mechanism like VCG, right? And basically these three methods are used with declining frequency. So probably the most common thing to make a public decision is assessing by experts. Then using ineffective surveys probably plays a little bit of role, and I don't think anyone's ever used a VCG to do any significant public decision. There is sort of a key difference in this